Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burlyites. Before we get into today's pod, may I make a small request? If you like what you hear here, and you have a couple of minutes, could you please head over to Apple Podcast Ratings and Reviews, drop us a rating or a comment on the show. Could be anything, really. Our guests, my questions, these labored intros. Not my hair, though. That's out of bounds. All right, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because we've put together a panel of intrepid journalists. With me are Heather Scoffield, Ottawa Bureau Chief and economics columnist for The Star; Robert Fife, the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau Chief and former host of CTV Question Period, former guest on the Herle Burly; and Susan Delacourt, national columnist for The Star, frequent political commentator, four-time author, and longtime friend of the Herle Burly as well. So we're going to go through the issues of 2022 and talk about them and see what political implications they had, how the various political actors handled themselves through these things. But first, it's great to see all of you. How are you?
Nice to see you guys too.
You too. Thanks for asking.
You're all traveling all the time. Where the hell do I find you? Susan, where are you?
I'm in my house. In my house in Ottawa.
In your house in Ottawa.
The new
Go
Edinburgh
ahead.
branch. The new Edinburgh branch of the Toronto Star.
Heather, if that's your house, I really feel badly for you.
I know. I'm in a classroom in Montreal. I'm just up here for the day at COP15, and so I had to do a panel, and I'm in the basement of UQAM, a university classroom, taking me back to the day.
Jesus, yes, it looks like the Soviet Union. Hi, Bob. Where are you at?
At the office.
You're at the office?
Yes, sir.
And where's that?
100 Queen Street, World Exchange Plaza.
Okay, so 2 Ottawas, 1 Montreal. Well, thanks again for joining. And let's start with, I guess, the most recent thing, which is the inquiry into the Emergencies Act. You know, Susan, you covered this thing from ground zero of the occupation of Ottawa, covered all the testimony. My own impression was that I don't know how interested people were in the consequences of the inquiry. People seem to have reached a view that either the invocation of the act was legitimate or illegitimate. And as Corey tonight said on this show, everything else is a Rorschach test. You see what you want to see in it. But my sense was that the government managed that committee process as well as that can be done. What do you think, Susan?
Yeah, definitely. I think they managed it better than I thought they were going to manage it. Heather and I, we work together and we joke about this a lot. This is a government that is very good at saying nothing. It has developed it to a high art. And I was really surprised.
Frustratingly so, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Frustratingly so, yes.
Yeah. It's a shame because they're capable of better. But I think it gave us a real insight. They opened up and gave us a real insight into what it's like to do crisis management. And it's as ugly as you think it is. And it's as random as you think it is. And there are personalities involved and petty politics and everything like that. So I think, it was like a reality show at times, that inquiry. I grew addicted to it, because if you went into political journalism, this is the kind of stuff you wanted to see and cover in politics. And I think, not to date myself with Bob here, but Bob and I think we're used to a bit more transparency when we started being reporters on the Hill too. That you would often get a glimpse of how government works, and this was the first one we've had of this government in a long time. So that's just stylistically. I do think we learned a lot in this, and we really got a picture of what the country looks like when it's been ravaged by COVID, a war in Ukraine, crisis after crisis, and sort of, the exhaustion of a system that's been sort of pressed to the brink here.
Right. Bob, did you learn everything you wanted to learn about the invocation of the Emergencies Act?
No, but I will say this, that wasn't the government's choice in providing transparency on what went on. We learned far more from the text messages and documents that were filed, that they were required to file to the judicial inquiry, than we did from the politicians. If they had their choice, we wouldn't have seen those documents. And I think, to Susan's point, we all learned just how complicated and dysfunctional government can be, which is probably why they don't want to let us know what is in those text messages. I didn't think that the government performed particularly very well on in the testimony, except for the Prime Minister on the final day. I thought he pulled the rabbit out of the hat. This was one of the most effective times that I saw Justin Trudeau perform. He made a strong political case, it seems to me, for why the Emergencies Act should be invoked. I don't think he made the legal case, because the government refuses to share with us the legal reasons for why they declared why they didn't think the CSIS Act, which the CSIS themselves had said did not meet the requirement for invoking the Emergencies Act. They never made that case because they haven't given us the legal reasons for it. But politically, and the polls show this, that the majority of Canadians are just fine with the government doing that, because they thought that these Freedom Convoy people, anti-vaxxers, were breaking the law, and the government should have had every right to bring them down, even though and we'll see what the judge says, whether it actually made the legal definition for invoking the act. And that we'll wait and see what the judge has to say.
Well, for better or worse, we seem to have learned. For better or worse, we seem to have learned through the last number of years, both here and in the States, that people only care about the outcome they want. They don't care about the process that led to that outcome particularly.
Can I say something about what I didn't learn that maybe goes to this point? I've been really curious what the heck that thing was. What was the Convoy? And I'm not sure that I know as much about it as I want to know. I think you and I talked about this in the summer, David. I got a really spooky feeling from that convoy, that there was something dark going on there. And I keep referring to Matt Gurney's article about what he was witnessing out at Coventry Road. And I got hints of it. I think we know it wasn't any one thing, but the level of foreign influence, the links to other movements, we're talking a day right here during a week where we've seen a similar kind of January 6th thing going on in Germany. I still don't know what that convoy is and how much we should be worried about it in future. And that, I think, is that's an ongoing question.
Right. Heather, what was your take on the whole thing?
Yeah, I didn't follow it as closely as Susan, but I was left with that very big question. At the time, there was an impression left by the government that there were dangerous elements out there, very dangerous, that there was an underpinning of white supremacy, and that it was organized somehow. And there was also a lot of talk about foreign money, foreign influence, and what came out at the inquiry did not really answer those questions. And yet, we think back to last February. They froze people's bank accounts if they suspected that. That's serious stuff, and it has implications for the trust in the financial system and for trust in government going forward. At the time, that the comfort was that, okay, we have the Emergencies Act here in place, and there will be accountability after the fact. So the government can't just go out there and do whatever it wants. They have to answer to the public through this inquiry. But the inquiry didn't actually fully answer those questions or fully address those claims that were made at the time to justify the use of the act.
Let's continue with that for a second.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Sure.
I want to give you my kind of perspective on, because I covered the convoy for the 3 weeks they were here as well. And there were sort of three groups, it seems to me. And we have to figure this out. One was down by the Chateau Laurier Hotel, there was the Pat King thugs, who I think you could legitimately, when you're around them, you could feel like this was a kind of a dangerous environment. And then you had Party Central right on Parliament Hill, where it was a lot of people who were basically from Gatineau and from Vanier, and they were coming up and smoking dope and drinking and having a lot of fun and having hot tubs and bouncy castles. And then there were all of these rigs that started largely from Parliament Hill all the way down to the Supreme Court, all the way down Kent Street, almost to Somerset. Now, these were, I spoke to a lot of these people, and they were, there are people who own $400,000, $500,000 rigs, are generally law-abiding, they pay their taxes, they work very hard, they're very individualistic. It was clear that they had badly misinformed about COVID. I mean, some of the conspiracy theories about vaccinations and that were like head shaking. But they were not people who I felt were dangerous, that they were going to take a gun or. So it seemed to me that we've got to figure out what would motivate law-abiding people who generally are law-abiding, who do pay their taxes and work very hard to do that. Yes, they're informed about vaccination, but there's a larger issue here. Our political leadership has to figure this out, because this is something that we should be worried about. And I think that's what Susan is trying to address.
Do you have a theory about it, Bob?
Well, I don't really, because I think we need to really, politicians need to go out and talk to people in these rural areas or truckers in Toronto who do this kind of work, and find out what do we do? It wasn't just vaccination. They feel like they're left out of the system. And that's something we have to address. On the larger issue, on the more security issue, which we have to be concerned about clearly, is this foreign funding, foreign influence. Some of the leaders of this group have real ties to right-wing extremism in the United States and maybe beyond in Europe. And that is something that our security forces, Canadians, I think our security and law enforcement agencies have woken up to and are taking it much more seriously. But there is still a huge swath of people who are Canadian citizens and generally law-abiding that we cannot simply dismiss as, a bunch of racists or a bunch of ignorant people, because they're not.
Hey, Heather, give us some straight talk here. The government relied quite heavily on economic damage as a justification for the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and that the blockades on the bridges and to some extent Ottawa were causing, had the potential to cause significant economic rupture, even affect our relationship with the United States, and therefore that was one of the reasons why they brought it in. Is that true?
It's true. In the potential for economic damage was certainly there, and the potential for poor relations between Canada and the U.S. were certainly there. I mean, we saw the transcripts of the phone calls back and forth. That was very, very high level conversations that were going on, saying fix this thing, at a time when the economy was in a pretty rough shape. Our supply chains were being disrupted all over the place, and just even the thought of not being able to get, the trade that was actually able to work, to go out there and disrupt it further was a very big deal. And the reputational damage could have also been huge. I mean, I think we were still limping away from that because it was allowed to happen. So yeah, there was that huge potential, but that we're still taken up to the fact that, did they need the Emergencies Act to actually resolve that, right? I mean, that's what the inquiry was supposed to figure out. And, those borders were cleared before they actually invoked the act. So maybe the fact that there was economic damage, for me, still doesn't necessarily, it might or might not justify the use of the act, but there was certainly the backdrop.
Right. So if Judge Rollo concludes the government did not have the legal justification to invoke the act, is that going to be a big story?
No, I don't think so. I think you're right with what you said at the outset, that people had their minds made up about this. And I think I would say I haven't seen a definitive poll result on this, but I think it's definitely a majority who would say, I just wanted the government to fix it.
It's about 70-30.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what I think the judge's job, if I may be presumed to be so bold, is not to look backward and say, in retrospect, should they have done it or not? But how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Not just the convoy. And Bob raises some really good issues there. We still don't know what has. I think we were all shocked by that. The sight of Heather and I talked about this too. Who were those people appearing who didn't come to Ottawa but appeared at the overpasses and waved them on? What is that mood out there? I think it's our job to care about that. But I do think that we're going to see Rouleau talk about where our laws, our security laws, are inadequate to the kind of challenges posed in a post-pandemic, a disruptive world. And our laws right now are for Cold War type disruption, and we are way beyond that now. So I think that's what we're going to see, and that would be a good thing.
I've got my glow on, Herle Burlyites. Nope, not that kind of glow. It's the glow I typically feel as the calendar rolls into December. The most wonderful time of the year, as the song says, giving season. Not that I think of giving necessarily as a season, but this time of year, it's part of the brand. You all know that our presenting sponsor is TELUS. As a company built from day one with a social purpose, giving is a core value with them, happening 365 days a year. Core values don't take any days off, eh? Giving comes in thousands of forms with TELUS. A rather influential one is the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation, an independent registered charity that believes all youth, regardless of circumstance, deserve an equal opportunity to reach their full potential. It was launched in 2018 with an endowment from TELUS to support its admin costs forevermore. You'll pardon the rhetorical flourish, just emphasizing that the foundation will always direct every single penny of every single donation it receives to local charities in Canada. Over 500 charities each year providing education and health programs, many enabled by technology. Over 2 million youth in communities across Canada are being helped. The foundation has 2 unique programs. Local community board grants provide grants up to $20,000 to local youth charities, and innovation grants providing multi-year funding of up to $200,000 for breakthrough ideas in youth mental health or environmental education and climate action programs for youth. In 2022 alone, and it's not over yet, there have been 548 grants adding up to more than $10.5 million. Since 2018, over $35 million in grants. Remember when I said giving wasn't only a season for TELUS? We'll tell you some of these Friendly Future Foundation giving stories in the next few weeks. But for now, you can learn more about it at friendlyfuture.com. Hey, Bob, one of the people who had a tricky job managing their way through this inquiry was Pierre Poilievre. Because the numbers in the country are 70-30. Corey said on The Curse of Politics that as long as people are talking about this inquiry, it's great for the Liberals because their decision to invoke the Emergencies Act is more popular than they are. 70% of the people support it and only 30% support them. So it's a great topic for them to be on. There was a lot of thought at the beginning of this thing that Poilievre could get dragged into it, that his and his caucus's footsie with the convoy and the occupiers would come back to bite them. But he basically was invisible through this whole process by design, I presume, and didn't get caught up in it near as I can tell.
Well, not after he won the leadership, but then he disappeared from the media landscape during this whole inquiry. And, just yesterday, my goodness gracious, he had his first news conference with reporters and he actually answered questions. Would that have anything to do with that inquiry? But look, he's going to pay a price for this. You and I know, because you used to do those kind of things for the Liberals, they've collected all of this damaging clips of him with these truckers, and it's a 70-30. There is no appetite in this country for any politician to support people who break the law. regardless of their motivations or their feelings that the government is not listening to them. And that is going to hurt him during the election campaign, as well as this ridiculous stuff. If you remember him in his sock feet with a hookah pipe, smoking with a hookah pipe, talking about how great cryptocurrency is. Well,
that's in a Herle ad for sure, Bob. That is in a Herle ad for sure.
Yeah, that is, and a lot of people have lost a lot of money on this cryptocurrency, and probably some of them because they believed this nonsense from Pierre Poilievre. So he's going to
too much.
He may not pay the price tomorrow, but it'll come back to haunt him.
Yeah,
I thought what was really damaged. Go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say, public opinion, I think, is definitely in the Liberals, on the Liberals' side here in terms of invoking the act. But the convoy has had a lasting impact that actually helps some, over the long term, some of what Pierre Poilievre is arguing for: less intrusion from government. There's this, there's no appetite anymore to impose even masks, right? There was a lot of COVID fatigue at the time. It manifested itself on the streets. There were a lot of other things happening in the background there, but the regular people that came out were fed up with I think there was a whole sentiment there with governments. They did not want governments telling them what to do, and Pierre Poilievre rides that wave. Yes, at the time he rode it way too hard, and obviously as Bob was saying, like, a step back from that. But that underlying sentiment, I think, is something that he can still tap into.
Something over 60% of people say that there should be a mask mandate right now. Do you see 6 out of 10 people wearing masks when you walk around the street?
No, and I'm not one of those too.
No. Hey, so let's turn to the economy, because this has been a hell of an interesting year and an unexpected year, because we were assured that this would not happen, this inflation and cost of living increases that have come throughout the economy.
Pierre Poilievre said it would.
Well, that's a big part of this, Bob. That's a big part of this. But the official voices assured us that this would not happen, and now it has happened. And now it's bringing pain. Now it has to cost people their jobs. Now it has to cost people their houses, and these are the kinds of things. Maybe not so much inflation. I'm trying to learn what I think about this. That maybe inflation is a survivable political thing, but recessions generally aren't. So, what kind of? Let's start with you, Heather. What kind of year are we heading into, do you think, in terms of economic activity, and how well has the government positioned itself politically to survive that?
So, a lot of the forecasts right now are for a mild recession. I think, from the Liberals' point of view, that's probably the best case scenario, that we have a few months, possibly 6 months of no growth. Some jobs are lost, but we're in a pretty good, unemployment right now is at rock bottom. And so it doesn't actually, the hope is anyway, that it doesn't actually manifest itself in terms of, places closing down and large numbers of people losing their jobs. And so we kind of muddle through. And on the political side of that, are the Liberals ready for it? A mild recession, it's not, it doesn't have to be, terrible for them, except, I would just say that the very basic instrument that all governments depend on to guide them through a recession, it's employment insurance, or unemployment insurance as it used to be. That's the backstop. It kicks in. It's an automatic stabilizer. It
covers about 17 people now, doesn't it?
Exactly. Well, that's the thing, right? They've been promising for how many years now to reform it. It's supposed to be done by the end of the year, but there's so much lethargy in trying to fix that system and actually make it applicable to the workforce of today. And I think that's really a vulnerability for the Liberals right now.
Can I just say this? Say this? The government is very good at spending money, but they're very bad at managing government. Whether it's passports.
What do you mean by that?
Well, whether it's passports or whether it's a 2 million backlog in the immigration department, whether it's rolling out pandemic money where they didn't even they didn't even take people's SIN numbers. so they could actually see if they were legitimately working or had two jobs or not. This is a consistent pattern with this government. They talk a good game, and they certainly are willing to throw money in every direction. But the actual job of governing effectively on things that matter to ordinary Canadians, they don't do so well at that.
Right. Susan, the recession of the early 90s killed the Mulroney government. The recession of the early 80s killed the Trudeau Liberal Turner government subsequently. What do you sense from the Trudeau government about their attitudes about what is happening and what it makes them think about election timing or the length of their confidence and supply agreement? Any of those things, are they contingency planning?
So this sounds like I'm not answering the question, but I do know, and you probably know too, we all do, they pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the United States. And the recent elections, the midterms, and then even the Georgia runoff this week, kind of put paid to this idea that people will put the economy first. That if people are hurting, they're going to punish the people in power. Joe Biden has had Biden's victory, such as it is, in those midterms, being the only incumbent president to actually see gains during midterms, tells you that something else is going on with the electorate than just voting with their wallets, which is something I've always wanted to believe. But we saw that abortion rights and maybe the threats to democracy are really serious enough in the United States. So I expect that the Trudeau government is probably watching that with some interest and thinking, if we have a story to tell that isn't just the economy, that isn't just how we've managed money, because as Bob says, God knows that's not their strength, then I wouldn't say it's a huge weakness. I think shoveling money is a problem. But I think what they've lacked is a story about what Canada looks like, when they're through with it, or what Canada has done that's better. And I think if they're probably watching the United States, I don't know this authoritatively, to see what was motivating people besides their pocketbook concerns in those midterms. And is there some way that a government can survive an economic downturn with those factors in play, if that makes sense?
So we don't have a Roe versus Wade issue in Canada. Is that why they're trying to create a culture war about guns right now?
Oh, maybe. I don't know. I expect the democracy thing will show up in some form or another, and that is why they like the Convoy thing. That is why they enjoyed the Convoy for its comparisons to January 6th. I'm not saying, I don't want to leave the impression they enjoyed the Convoy. I think it was traumatizing to them. But I do think that that the more that the Poilievre kind of movement can be attached to the Fox News Trump agenda will make them happy.
Right. In terms of actual economic management itself, does these people look like they're on top of it? Heather, you've probably interviewed Chrystia Freeland. Does she give you confidence that she's on top of this stuff?
I think they are. They were slow to deal with inflation when it was clearly. It grew and grew and grew as a problem throughout the year, and it was pretty obvious that there were supply chain problems that were causing prices to go up. There were lots of issues in Europe and the invasion of Ukraine, which were causing commodity prices to go up. I mean, that was in February, and it just got worse and worse since then. And we saw other countries moving ahead of us. And at a certain point, it was very predictable. And yet it took Chrystia Freeland until the summer to really say, okay, we're going to do something about this. And even then it was a repackaging of old measures, which they could have talked about from the get-go, right? There's confronting inflation from a fiscal policy standpoint is extremely difficult. You can do things at the margins, but they are perfectly capable of helping people or looking at who's being hurt, or how do you help people get through to the other side? And it took her a long time to do that. And now we're I think the government is probably in a similar situation now because, okay, they did a bunch of measures on affordability, which is kind of the flip side of inflation. And, people are not able to afford things because they're getting so expensive. Right. So they've done, they did a few things in the fall economic statement, but now the Bank of Canada has signaled it is about to stop raising rates. Probably the next January will probably be the last time, or maybe even this week was the last time. So now we find ourselves in a situation where, okay, if people are still being hurt by prices that are high and they're going to stay high for quite a while, there's a lot of pressure on the Liberals to just do something. What do you do in that situation? I'm not seeing a huge amount of good ideas coming out.
I want to talk for a minute about an unsexy, plain brown, unprepossessing thing that has nonetheless managed to acquire iconic status in the Canadian institutional memory. The railroad boxcar. We've all seen them at some point. Usually so many bolted together behind a locomotive that you can't see the end of the train. Every kid on the prairies and quite a few elsewhere in Canada has squirmed in the back seat of the family sedan at a rail crossing, watching a solid wall of those rectangular brown cuboids, yes, that's the geometric term, clicking by for what seemed like forever. Boxcars have looked basically the same for nearly 200 years. That timelessness has made them famous. Bandits chased them in westerns. Hobos jumped onto them in the 30s. Stuntmen leaped out of their sliding doors in movies. And over the decades, they transported just about everything, everywhere. Our sponsor, CN, operated wooden boxcars during the company's early years, 30,000 of them at one point. They were eventually ruled fire hazards and phased out. In the 50s, the railway began using steel boxcars. One particular fleet was nicknamed Buffalo Cars because of the Manitoba buffalo image each one displayed. They were originally used to move newsprint, then modified to haul grain to Churchill and Thunder Bay. The arrival of specialized hopper cars in the second half of the last century removed the grain mission from boxcars, but they remain in use for just about everything else. Modern boxcars are bigger and more sophisticated, often refrigerated or cushioned. CN is actually acquiring 800 new ones, 60 feet long, high capacity, and yes, still brown. It might seem a little counterintuitive to be spending millions expanding capacity like that in a period of economic uncertainty, but CN believes that constant reinvestment in the railroad, regardless of the economic cycle, is wise. Massive disruptions to supply chains in Europe and Asia are putting pressure on Canadian producers, and governments in North America are talking a lot about nearshoring, and there's a severe shortage of truckers. So CN needs more boxcars and keeps buying more for forest products, or metals, or minerals, or auto parts, or bagged agricultural products, or whatever. Because, as I've said here a few times, cargo has to move, and boxcars just keep rolling. To a certain extent, the Bank of Canada has to stand on its own in this. The government can't really carry the Bank of Canada's water, and the bank is out there. And, previously, because I'm old, I remember that Gerald Bowie was a household name and not in a good way. And I remember that John Crow was a household name and not in a good way. How's Tiff Macklem doing? How is the bank doing in explaining to Canadians what they're doing?
Can I, the non-economic brain in the thing, take a stab at answering that? Because something's been rattling around my head. I'm a big fan of Jim Stanford, just about anything he says. And he's been talking this week about the rate increases, and Heather and Bob know this better than I do. But he's saying that if people are getting mad at the Bank of Canada, they may be right to be mad at the Bank of Canada, because everybody is at least vaguely aware, I think, that inflation isn't Canadians' fault. It's not that Canadians are out there spending up a fortune. It's because of the global situation. And the rate increases, making everything more expensive in a time of inflation, feels like punishment on top of 2 years of being punished. And I get a vague, Jim Stanford, when I listened to him say that people are being punished for what they didn't do, I thought, yeah, that's making me mad too. And I wouldn't be surprised if people are annoyed about that as well, is that this feels like punishment that we don't deserve.
When I walk into the bill, sorry, Heather, please go ahead.
Governor Macklin made some mistakes along the way too, right? I mean, he's been pretty upfront about that, which is refreshing. And just to go back to our earlier comment about Liberals having a proclivity to say a lot of nothing, Macklin has come clean and said, okay, I messed this up. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there were mistakes made, not just by him, but by a lot of central bankers around the world in terms of, not seeing the inflation coming, but also, I mean, in particular in
If I could just stop you, just because just on that point, Heather, they talk a lot, these central bankers from around the world, right? They coordinate what they're doing, especially with the United States, presumably.
They talk a lot. I wouldn't, did they officially, collaborate on raising rates and coordinate the rate hikes? Not exactly, but they all are certainly heading in the right direction, in the same direction for the same reasons. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's all done at the World Economic Forum.
Klaus just gives them their marching orders. Yeah. Sorry, Heather, I cut you off, and you were in the middle of talking about that.
Explaining about his mistakes. So he didn't call inflation soon enough. He let the quantitative easing go on too long, too big. But I think the big Canadian-made problem was talking about forward guidance, like telling people that rates were going to stay low for a long time, and that was clearly wrong. And how many people actually made decisions to borrow, to borrow perhaps not wisely, based on that advice? And he's reeling it back in now, but it hurts to reel it back in at this late stage in the game.
Right, variable rates, for example, in your mortgage.
Yeah.
Right.
So my security guard, when I come into the building, said to me the other day, "So we're going to have these high interest rates for quite a while, eh?" And that's got to worry the Liberals, as you well know. And particularly if the United States economy begins to slow down in the new year, that's really going to have an effect, because then you're going to start to have layoffs in manufacturing and companies. So you have a government that'll be going into an election with 10 years, and that's about the end of people's tolerance for a government, or with the prime minister. And Trudeau doesn't really poll that well now amongst people. So you have the government.
Who does he poll well amongst?
Well, maybe certain Liberals, but he's got a problem, a political problem, because for all of the baggage that Poilievre may have, if people decide that's it, then the government is in trouble. I mean, we saw that in Ontario in the first election campaign. Ford was way out there, far right, and in a lot of ways did not seem to be an electable politician, and yet he won a majority government. So, there's
Thanks for that, Bob.
Sorry, were you part of that?
Hey, thanks for that, Bob. As I've forgotten all about that. It's good of you to remind me. That a guy who looked completely unelectable beat the shit out of me. Yeah, thank you. But while we're talking about that, let me just give you. Let me just throw a little factoid on the table. So, Stephen Harper governed for 9 years and then he lost. Okay. Kretschmann governed for 8 or 9 years and then his party threw him out before the public could. And before that
was you, David.
That was the party. And then and then before that, Mulroney governed for 9 years and then he left before he could lose. And before that, Trudeau went from 68 to 79 and lost to Joe Clark in 1979. And before that, John Diefenbaker governed for 7 years. And before that, Louis Saint-Laurent governed for 9 years before he lost. Do you see where I'm going here? Mm-hmm. No prime minister in the modern era, in any way of describing the modern era, has lasted longer than 10 years and won a subsequent election. So the conditions where a party actually wins a subsequent election generally happen in two circumstances, and the second point will take us into the Conservative leadership, which is, first of all, generally you change your leader. I'm not, by the way, saying the Liberals should do that because I don't know that they have an obvious alternative. But when parties have extended their term in office, that's what they do, is they change their leader. The second thing, and it's a necessary precondition, is that the alternative be seen as unacceptable. Not just not ready, not just inexperienced, not just maybe even not as good. Unacceptable. Because after 10 years, people want a new thing and they want change. So Poilievre's job, fundamentally, is not to become unacceptable. How's he doing?
He's working on it. You can see he's working on it. Bob noticed that the press conference. I noticed within, I'd say about a week of the Convoy hearings, we started hearing not what a great bunch of Canadians they were, but that Pierre Poilievre was always against people who break the law. He stayed away from vaccine mandates and that kind of crazy stuff in question period. He's saying Canada is broken, and anybody who is that is a pervasive sentiment, whether the governments are in charge of it or not. Look at just the list of what feels broken. I just went through airports this week on a trip, and airports feel broken. Hospital emergency rooms feel broken. Your finances feel broken. The security guard at Bob's building feels like things are broken. And the more that Pierre Poilievre hammers away at that, I think he's touching on I hate to use the word zeitgeist, but that you can pick that up anywhere, in the grocery store, on the bus, in the bar. People feel like everything's broken. So I'd say he's doing well on that.
Yeah, and one of the things that he's enormously effective is in social media. His, 2 weeks ago, he did a really effective video. Even though a lot of people who are experts in the field thought he was really wrong in terms of the safe drug injection sites, but that video really hit home to people who are, he went down to the Lower East Side in Vancouver, and he talked about look what Justin Trudeau has done, and that's not the way to do it. You need to have addiction counseling, that sort of thing. Experts in the field criticize them quite rightly so, but as a video, if you're seeing that was really effective. This guy doesn't do Chamber of Commerce speeches anymore. He does videos, and they're really good. And it reaches a large audience of people. He's not relying on, CTV or CBC to show these clips or on us as print reporters to write about it. He's going directly to people with very, very effective messages. And, he is a really good communicator, and he's very effective in question period as well.
Do you find the prospect of him as Prime Minister to be scary, Heather?
12:50 p.m.
He is. I'm going to sidestep that question. I think he's deliberately. I just thought I'd give you the goods there. But he is deliberately making himself not scary right now, and because I am watching every word he's saying on the Bank of Canada, it is striking that he's gone like that. The crazy talk from a year ago, or even he was on that. That the Bank of Canada governor has got to go, and that he's corrupt, and that he's in bed with the Liberals and doing their dirty work for them and so forth. He was on that even before he was running for the leader, and then he doubled down during his leadership. He's completely backed off that. So he hasn't pulled a narrow no tool where he's reversed it. He's just kept quiet about it, and that's very deliberate. There's still those elements. I mean, Andrew Scheer is still out there on that. He still goes and gives news conferences about some of those elements around the Bank of Canada. But I just think that's an example about how he is completely aware that kind of talk, that anti-institutional, going at the backbone of how Canada works, it's not going to fly. And he's going to be quiet about that kind of thing and show people that he's not quite as scary as the Liberals are making him, or no doubt will try to make him out to be.
Can I say one other thing about that too? That's a little behind the scenesy, but it really struck me was when he hired Ian Todd as his chief of staff. And again, because I'm old, I do know Ian Todd, and Ian was a loyal, steadfast, solid, decent guy with Preston Manning for years and years and years. And Ian Todd is sort of the opposite of flappable. Like he doesn't tend to run with the crazy crowd. So putting Ian Todd, it was a very in his chief of staff is a very adult move, and that told me that he means business on this. I'm trying not to be scary thing.
He did what he had to do to win that Conservative leadership, and he won it by a huge margin by playing to the party base. But now we're beginning to see signs of the advice he got from Brian Mulroney, who went over to Stornoway and said, you gotta go fishing where the fish are. And I think he's beginning to move in that direction. Let's wait and see. Jury's out here. But it'll be interesting to see. He's put together a very interesting front bench of shadow cabinet critics. And even though, his finance critic is not is a small business person and doesn't have the creds of somebody on Bay Street.
But it's a huge statement, that it's not Michael Wilson.
It's
right?
not Michael Wilson. No, but it also means he can understand the small business person,
exactly.
right?
That's what I'm saying. It's a very deliberate move.
And it goes into the immigrant community, because so much of our small business sector are immigrants who've come here and started businesses. That's a smart move. And even in keeping Michael Chong as foreign affairs critic, Michael is a really solid, sensible conservative. So you're not going to have somebody going off on wild tangents. That to me was a smart move, and then picking somebody like Raquel Dancho, who was the national public safety critic. She's young. She's very attractive. She's very smart. She's measured in her comments, but also she does her homework. She's very effective in committee, and looks good in the House of Commons. So if he can bring his caucus together in a way that they can work together to come up with policies that can be attractive to, mainstream Canadians or the people who don't just vote Conservative, because the only way they're going to win is they have to attract people who don't vote Conservative or are fed up with the Liberals and a lot of blue Liberals, for example, who are kind of feeling that this government doesn't understand business. That's where they can potentially, if that plays out the way I think it might, he could win.
Can I just mention another thing? The states again. There was a phrase used around the time midterms, has the fever broken in the United States, and is the Trump nonsense finally over? I'm knocking wood here. My bias is right out in the open, but that maybe the Trump craziness has run its course in the United States, and you see even Republicans kind of gently backing away. And I think that's going to be watched by people like Danielle Smith in Alberta and Poilievre, which is, yes, it's a great way to whip up the base to do all this, the Trump style populism, but it's not a winning formula for the long term. And I think we're seeing that in the States, and it may be instructive here to the right wing anyway.
I ask you as people. Poilievre is explicitly rejects the role you play and what you do, and is deliberate about his intent to bypass you. How do you feel about that?
I feel like shit about that, frankly. My other two panelists on here know too that the Stephen Harper years were no fun. They were, and I don't want my job to be just fun. I just don't want to be antagonized. And it was more than putting us in our place. There was a lot of deliberate antagonism going on. And I've been struck. I think they are moderating it a bit, but a lot of the statements you saw coming out, for example, when Pierre Poilievre refused to appear in a debate, he said, "I'm not going to." He trashed Tom Clark as a former Laurentian elite. This is the kind of stuff that the Harper folks would say in a bar or behind the scenes.
Right.
They would never say it in a press release. And I thought, we are getting just a glimpse of not just ignoring us, it's deliberately slapping journalists in the face. And I would not be surprised if they came into power and walked through their threats to shut down CBC. That's a big money raiser for them. I think
that's not a threat. That's an explicit promise and commitment to their voters. I think you should expect that they will do that.
Right. So what do we, we are people, but I'm going to speak as a longtime journalist. I actually do believe we perform a public service, and I don't believe that. I think it's alarming if you decide that the people who do accountability and the sort of a monitoring of the generally agreed upon set of facts are suspect. If you whip up the public against us, I think that's going to be a problem, not just for us as people, but for democracy too, without sounding too highfalutin about it. I just think it's a bad idea, and it worries me.
The thing that bugs me so much is that whereas he's trying to delegitimize accountable journalism, and we are all accountable. We have ombudsmen, we have press councils, broadcasters do the same thing. I mean, there is accountability here. Yet at the same time, they're grabbing our stories, the ones that we do that are fact checked, that are have editors have gone through, and leading off question period with it. They are relying on us to do their work in the House of Commons. So that is a real. So I worry. Obviously, like Susan, I worry that when you have mainstream political leaders trying to delegitimize media in this country, which make an effort, all of our organizations make an effort to provide, factual. Balanced material. It's different with columnists. Columnists can write whatever they want, but the news stories if you look at whether it's the CBC or the Globe Mail or Toronto Star or the National Post, the reporters do, I think, very legitimate work. But this government deserves a lot of criticism, because they came in and adopted the Harper agenda, which is, and I don't mean that, yes, the Prime Minister scrums, although he doesn't say very much, but he does scrum, and his ministers do talk to us, and thank you for that. But public servants don't talk to us anymore. Okay. This is the effect of the Harper years. He came in, he shut down. David, I used to be able to talk to ADMs at Finance. Sure. Not for political stuff. They
would just explain to you what they were thinking and what they were doing.
Exactly. They don't do that anymore. Press secretaries don't return their phone calls. In fact, their phones don't even go. Many of them don't even go onto a message. You can leave a message with them, and when you send them, so you have to send them questions on email, and then many hours later, because it's got to go to the PMO and back, you got gobbledygook at the end of the day. Yeah. So this is not good for democracy. And we're now having hearings on the Access to Information Act, which is about 50 years old, has not been changed. Government, as the media gets smaller and shrinking in size, government is shrinking the access and the information that it gives to journalists and then hence to the public, which is bad for democracy. And I worry, like Susan, that if the Conservatives come in, it's going to get even worse.
Yeah.
Well, because these things work, I guess, is why they stay. Because, whenever I have people from the cabinet on this show, people invariably say, well, that person's smarter and more articulate than I thought they were based on what I have seen of them before. And it's because they're not allowed to say anything, as you said, Bob. And, but on the other hand, so maybe they could look more impressive and maybe members of the cabinet could have personalities that they don't. But this government's had a pretty small number of people in trouble over the course of its time. When you think of previous governments and cabinet ministers getting in trouble for things they said or et cetera, these people don't have much of that going on.
Well, the prime minister gets into a lot of trouble. Aga Khan, SNC Lavalin, blackface, you name it.
And ineffective opposition too doesn't help, right? I mean, there's that. Plus, during the whole Chrétien era, we had the underlying opposition of Paul Martin there too, which helps in terms of
Who's
coverage.
in charge of this conversation, anyways? For God's sake, people keep turning it back around me. Sorry, Heather, what was your point?
Those were great days, though. I'd get a cabinet meeting, I'd get a phone call from Scott Reed, and then I'd get one from Peter Donolo.
But, I would just say, okay, I'm a big proponent of working really hard and finding different ways to find out the information and to get facts and to hold the government to account. And you know what? We learned how to do that under Stephen Harper. It wasn't fun. It was frequently very adversarial, and we took a lot of personal insults to us from people in power. But we honed our document skills. We figured out how to do ATIP really efficiently and much better than in the past. We figured out ways to who was talking to them when we talked to them. We figured out our ways around. But if it's different now because we have a huge amount of disinformation that's floating around out there on social media that's so much more readily available than anything that we're writing and putting out there. So that countervailing force really undermines our efforts. We can keep working hard and try to hold people to account and find out what is actually the truth. But when we're up against a wall of untruth, it's very difficult.
Hey, what do you all think about the release of the text messages in the Emergencies Act inquiry? I'll tell you, as a former person that played in that world, I don't think that's fair. I think those things are modern day, the way people have modern day conversations. And there's a difference between the formality one puts in a formal document and the informality with which one discusses things off the record. And so just like when ATI was put in place, it was not contemplated that people's private conversations would be accessible. But now those private conversations happen on text. And since they're written down, they are accessible. And I don't think they should be. What do you think?
I have two answers to that. Yeah. I have two answers to that. One, as a human, I agree with you, it's probably not fair. As a journalist, I love them. I want them every single day. I want all of the text messages all the time. That was fabulous, the inquiry for that. And I want to tell the government, look, you opened up and it wasn't that scary. It didn't turn out to be that scary in the end. Nobody made a fool of themselves. There was a little embarrassing thing where Marco Mendicino was trying to go and take credit for the operation in Windsor. There was little moments like that. And the way communications people talk to each other, that was embarrassing too. There was a lot of that, but there was nothing.
But it always would be. It's not those people. It's not those individuals. It's that job.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, communications is not pretty. But I don't know. I have to answer it as a journalist and as somebody who believes in transparency, and I like it. I like it, and it was entertaining too.
Why do political aides have any should have any better protection than journalists? For example, there's a lot when you do an ATIP, you can get and it's happened. You can get text messages between journalists and politicians or their political aides, and that's released. Why do political aides have to have some kind of special protection? You're paid by taxpayers. And to Susan's point, there might have been some, somebody swore or some little bit of embarrassment, but the absolute substance of those discussions was really interesting, and I don't think it was overly detrimental to the government, at all. And in fact, it was illuminating.
Yeah, yeah. Made them have personalities.
Heather, what do you think?
Certainly better than than the statements we get from.
Oh my gosh! So who's in charge of those? And can we just get rid of the first paragraph on every single one of those things? Let's just
Why? What's in the first paragraph, Heather? What's in the first paragraph?
Every single one of them has to use a phrase that was used earlier here, gobbledygook about it's a value statement, and values are all great. But can we put them at the bottom of the press release? Put the news at the top, please. But I would just say, I think I love the inquiry for that, for showing the world that, actually government is serious here. There's some serious stuff going on. People are generally mature enough to look past, some untoward wording here and there, and figure out what's actually going on. And if the government actually, if the politicians are doing their work, they shouldn't be afraid of having that communication out there. And it helps us have a much better understanding of how things are right now. And especially under Harper, when there was such a vice grip on information, like just regular facts, we are left to put together. We're going to write anyway. We're going to tell the story anyway. So better have more information out there than not, because it helps us have a fuller idea of the story.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that? Sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I had an epiphany a year or so ago that this Liberal government speaks in adjectives. That's what Heather's saying is all in the first statement. They only keep describing themselves. The opposition, the media, we want verbs. We want what you're doing. And all we keep getting is we're nice. And it would be nice if they spoke in more verbs. That's what I really enjoyed, the use of verbs in communication.
I can't tell you how many times this happens, David. You're doing a story, and you're going to do the story. So give me an answer that explains your side. Instead, you get nonsense, and the answer is not even relevant to what the story is about. The story gets published. Everybody's going crazy about the story. Now they're writing to you saying, "Oh, we really want to tell you what what really has happened here." Well, that could have been in the story from the beginning, and you would have had your say. It may not have changed the overall direction, but at least you got your oar in the water, right?
Right.
I have had phone calls with set up interviews. I was talking about this to our editor yesterday, where ministers have asked to be interviewed, which is very nice. That's lovely. And I have had it happen at least twice where I've had to phone my editor and say that interview was absolutely useless. There is nothing in there. There's nothing in that interview.
You know that Kevin Carmichael from the National Post, from the Financial Post, told me on this show that he wouldn't bother to interview Chrystia Freeland because he wouldn't learn anything.
Yeah, see, that's bad.
Yeah, I think we got to at least try. You have to at least try to push them harder. And that's part of I think that's our job, to push them as hard as we can, get them to say something and take them down.
But that was really shocking to me, Heather, that somebody would say, you know what, it's not even a learning exercise to talk to a cabinet minister.
It has happened. It's happened to me. Yeah. And I discourage it. If any of those ministers are listening to this podcast, don't do that again. Right. Because it's a waste of time.
Hey, since this conversation originally started off with Poilievre, can I just loop back and ask you, three keen observers, whether you've seen anything in question period between Trudeau and Poilievre that give indication that people are going to square off against each other over the next couple of years?
Well, I think that Poilievre is much more effective as a questioner than Trudeau is in responding. But Trudeau is also, he doesn't, he's good. He's very effective in the House of Commons. But the advantage usually goes to a good communicator who's doing the attacking, and the government is doing the defending. So what we're not seeing is John Diefenbaker and pure Elliott Trudeau, which was really something to watch. But they're pretty good. I think they're fairly even, although I give the advantage to Poilievre largely because he is an effective communicator, but it's just the advantage of an opposition leader doing the attacking without having to have any responsibility. So it's easier for him to do it, I think.
Every cabinet minister, go ahead, Heather.
He has an ability to get under people's skin. And I think it's on Trudeau to make sure that doesn't happen because he could lose his cool. But I was interested in watching the finance committee a few weeks ago because Poilievre has frequently shown up there, and he's his typical self. He gets under people's skin right away, and it's very aggressive. He wasn't there, and the conservatives who were there I had a lot of the same arguments, the same lines that he did, but they didn't deliver them in the same way, and it was actually a very different vibe. And nobody's back got up, and they actually had kind of, I may even say, a bit of a productive conversation. That's not the case in the House of Commons when Poilievre is on his game.
I think Poilievre's going to have to be careful to draw the distinction between getting under the skin of liberals and getting under the skin of voters. I think we all know voters who say, there's something about that guy that bugs me. Like I went to high school with that guy, or, that I do think he's going to have to watch for that. He does annoy liberals for sure. I'm not sure he makes them quake, as Erin O'Toole talked about it, but I do think that Poilievre's going to have to watch for that. I think I've been telling all the ministers who will listen, they should go to the Mark Miller School of Communication. And I'm serious about that. Mark Miller should be leading seminars in how to talk to the media. But I think the Trudeau you saw at the emergency inquiry, I wouldn't be surprised if seeing the success of that, getting a Bob Fife to say that was a good job, or an Andrew Coyne to say it was good. I wouldn't be surprised if Trudeau, he's a learner, and he might start being a little more like that guy rather than the empty adjective spouter.
Interesting. Okay. So we only have time. We only have a few minutes left, but I really wanted to pick up on the super interesting stuff you were talking about everything is broken out there. And I want to extend it to the FedProv level, because I think we're seeing, in the past year, we've seen really interesting developments. They disturb me, but they're nonetheless interesting, about autonomy moves all over the place, and attempts to break out of the rules of federalism, if I might say, whether it's the Quebec government and its repeated use of the notwithstanding clause to exempt itself from charter rights that are pretty core to the Canadian value system about identity, etc. Whether it is the pincer move out west between Saskatchewan and Alberta about their various autonomy acts, or whether it's the Ford government's repeated use of the notwithstanding clause to try to exempt itself. In a lot of ways, it feels to me like these threads are breaking down in more fundamental ways than we have seen in the past. And I don't know where it goes. Do you anybody have any idea where this is going?
Can I give two answers to that? I'm completely with you on this. I'm a veteran of the constitutional wars. And what's really striking me in all of this is the old constitutional battles were about trying to get in. That we wanted Quebec to be a signatory to the Constitution. The West wanted what it wanted. Everybody wanted something from the Constitution. Now that, as you correctly say, they want out. And that fits with an anti-democratic trend that's going on all over the country, all over the world. So I am worried about that. I am less worried when sorry to harp on the inquiry, when I see how the Prime Minister and the Premiers talk to each other when they think nobody's looking. Right. Jason Kenney's big, thing against the Emergencies Act turned out to be a quibble with it in the conference call with Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau were like pals. And Doug Ford was going to use a wire brush to help out things. There is a level of rapport in this federation that is way more interesting than those stupid communiques that they issue at the end of FedProv. And I think we'll see the test of this. Danielle Smith has already had to moderate a bit. I think I want to see what's going to happen on health, because that's in an area where they still all want in and they want something. So nobody's asking to get out of the healthcare system yet. And that may be where we test this tension.
I do think that the federal government has to do much more to be concerned about regional concerns on the prairies, for example, whether it's how they deal with farmers over issues like fertilizer or firearms, and certainly the oil and gas sector of the economy, which I think the Liberals are actually coming around to now because of what's happened in Europe, that they realize that, we're going to have to move on pipelines, particularly for liquefied natural gas now. But these are kind of long-standing issues that pop up every now and again in our federation, and it's largely because Ottawa, with votes, a large number of MPs from Ontario and Quebec, kind of forget the sensitivities of the prairie provinces or Alberta. But the larger issue here, and is the one that Susan nailed, is that the Federation has to show it can work. And the most important issue facing this country right now is a collapsing healthcare system. And there needs to be federal leadership on this. And they need to, Trudeau really should be leaving everything aside and doing whatever he can to work with the provinces to find a solution. The solutions are there because the medical community and the nurses have provided solutions that will help alleviate the stresses in our Medicare system, but it needs federal leadership. It needs a real commitment from the Prime Minister. And if he can do something like that, I think it sends a message on these other issues that you've identified that may lessen the tensions or that we're now seeing.
Okay, Heather, let's just take healthcare for a second. I think we all agree that sometime in the next year or so, the federal government's going to write a very big check to the provinces. But I haven't talked to a single healthcare expert, and I've talked to a lot of them, and in fact, you won't find a single former premier who will say that sending a big check to the provinces will solve this problem. Everybody agrees that we need structural reform in the way we deliver healthcare, right? And everybody wants the federal government to use its financial leverage to drive that reform. But I don't sense a province in the country that would accept conditionality from federal money right now.
Oh, but that's a political game that stands the test of time, right? And if we look at the last round of talks, yeah, nobody wanted to sign on to conditionality either. But in the end, they all signed on one by one. The federal government pinged them off, and they got their money because I think in the end they do want the money. I think it's important to remember right now we're in a negotiation. Yeah, the talks broke down the last time, but of course they broke down. It was the first time that the federal government had gone out there with actually something concrete in terms of how they wanted to see it structured. And okay, so the answer was no, but that doesn't mean no forever. So I think it's a messy situation right now, and I think there is not a lot of patience among the voting public for this kind of bickering to go on and on. I mean, we hear it all the time. It's a truism in Canadian politics that there's only one voter, and I don't want to see the federal and provincial beating each other up when your child can't get proper attention in emergency, right? So I think that the crisis right now will focus the mind, at least eventually, and they'll figure it out. And to Bob's point, the leadership here right at this point is, that they're not actually out there with, okay, structural reform has to happen in this way, and you guys have to buy in, and let's collaborate here on how we're going to build that structure. And you can take that thread all the way through all their other federal provincial disputes too, like the waiting and seeing, and let's see what comes up, and let's talk about it for a long time. It's not working for the Liberals politically right now.
The reason I thought it might be different. The reason I thought it might be different this time is because traditionally, like when Martin cut a healthcare deal, it was asymmetrical, different rules for Quebec than for the rest of the country. And people accepted that Quebec was different and they could have different rules. But now provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan say, Quebec's not an exception, it's a role model. So what they get, we want. So if they don't have any restrictions, what is the possible argument for putting restrictions on us?
David, I'd love to see the Prime Minister call a conference of healthcare professionals, televise it, and listen to what the nurses and doctors and hospital administrators have to say that can fix this system. And then turn it over to the provinces. You want money? You run the healthcare system. The country's just heard from the people who know best what to do with this. Fix it. Let's get down to the negotiating table.
Excellent. Heather, did I cut you off? Did you have something more you wanted to say? No?
Nope, it's all good.
All right. So let's just close off. Give me an insight into what you're thinking about. What is the thing that you anticipate being interested about in 2023? What's the issue you're looking forward to following in 2023? Heather, start with you.
Right now, I'm thinking about perpetual crisis. I think we have been the volatility that we've been through over the past year, or more than that, but since the pandemic started, has been out of control. And I think the way governments and business and regular people have addressed these crises, they rely on what they know in the past. They rely on modeling, and it's just not working. And I don't know where the next crisis comes from. I don't know how we prepare for that. I'm looking very hard to try to understand that. But trying to peer into the future when you just don't know what's even coming at you from around the corner, I think it's going to cause a lot of angst. It's going to cause a lot of caution in people saving for a rainy day, or government acting very cautiously and not taking risk. And is that the right thing? So that's a very big idea there. I think we have to be ready for surprises, and I don't know how to do that.
Right. Susan?
I've referred to it a couple of times in this conversation. I'm interested in what's going on in the United States. I'm interested in this whole idea of, and whether it's linked to what's going on here, is whether we are finally seeing some kind of return to not crazy. Maybe we're never going to be normal, but whether the craziness has worked its way out of the system. Right. And so, I'll be watching to see how long the Liberal NDP deal holds, and things like that, and whether, as always, where the middle is in this country of ours, where it is, and healthcare.
Cool.
For me, it's the economy and healthcare, but I'm also somebody who loves politics, and I want to keep an eye on Poilievre to see where he goes. And I'm very interested in the leadership aspirants. They're all working behind the scenes, setting up their little organizations, trying not to catch the Prime Minister's eye while they're doing that. And so, as somebody who, we all are interested in that, and there's lots of talk about that. As I know you yourself are involved in the chitter chatter on this. So that's what I'm looking for.
I just say to all of them, find 30 seats in Quebec that you can win, and come back to me and have a conversation at that point.
There we go. Exactly.
Because that's the ball game. Listen, I want to thank you so much for doing this. You're all super busy people. You're all at the top of your craft. And let me pick up on something that Bob said earlier, which is that my two podcasts are entirely parasitic to what you do. And everything that I read is on Twitter, and all the other sources that I go to, aside from newspapers and television stations, is parasitic to the work that you do. It is absolutely fundamental and crucial to our democracy that we continue to have professional edited journalism covering things. And despite all the shit that gets thrown at you, please keep your heads up and do your job, because everybody else is relying on you for everything in this piece. So thank you for what you do, and thank all your colleagues for what you do. And now, on a more minor note, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, everybody who watched or listened, and again, the three of you for being on this week with us. Thank you so much. And we'll be back next week with more of the Herle Burly.